Hey there. Welcome back to the PK podcast, where that PK stands for Preacher's Kid, Not Perfect Kid. And it's a good thing, too, because my co-host, as always, one of the most not perfect people that I know, Eli Blevins, joining us from Wilmington, North Carolina, and has a baby coming soon. Lots of exciting things happening. We just got to make the pilgrimage to the white girl capital of the world. We went to Waco. And we enjoyed the silos, and it was incredible. How are you doing, Eli? What's going on?
It was great. Magnolia is just a paradise for females. Chip and Joanna Gaines, their whole empire of the silos and all that. It was pretty impressive, but I will say me and John did enjoy an $11 sweet tea there. So if you have $11 to spend, you can go spend it there. But no, it was great. It was good. Today's going to be a fantastic.
We went ahead and skipped the coffee shop, and I didn't feel the need to buy barn doors or windows. So the sweet tea was the way to go.
Yes. My wife, on the other hand, spent some good amount of money there. So it was great. But John, we got a fun day ahead for today. We have an incredible guest that's going to be coming on here today. And of course, John is the best host in the world for podcasting.
Oh my goodness. I'm stoked about today's episode. And I know I say that about everyone, but I feel like this is our first celebrity guest right here. Not that she ever intended to have a following. And that's what we love about her, is she's speaking truth and encouraging and challenging people from a biblical foundation. And if you're listening to this, I know you've seen her content, because I think we share every post that she puts out there. It's so exciting. Eli, you and I sometimes take a little flack for just being pretty direct. And then God sent us someone else in this space who is maybe more direct than we are sometimes. And I appreciate that. It fires me up. So I'm excited to welcome to the podcast today our friend Natalie. You know her on Instagram as Raised to Stay. Natalie, welcome to the show. We're so glad that you're here.
Oh, you guys, thank you. You make me feel so welcomed. And I just want to say hello and welcome to all the fellow stayers out there. We're in this together.
Amen. Right. It's exciting. And so we want to kick off our episode today with some rapid fire. We're just going to get to know you and kind of loosen up a little bit. So this is the first thing that pops into your mind. There's no wrong answers, maybe stupid answers sometimes, but no wrong ones. So here we go. Rapid fire. What is the grossest food you ever had to eat to be polite to a church member?
Oh my gosh. Oh, tomatoes. I hate tomatoes. They make in Cincinnati and Kentucky, they would make these tomato dishes and I just can't. They would put them in vinegar with pickles and stuff. It's like some sort of salad. So that's it.
Yeah, I would have to agree.
What's the first concert that you ever attended?
The Peace Dogs. Christian rock and roll with my dad.
Come on, Peace Dogs. I'm not sure if they have any new albums out. That's exciting. So name a part of children's church or maybe youth group that you wish we could incorporate into our regular church services now.
Gross games.
Absolutely. I can see that being a pre-sermon ritual for every Sunday. I think that'd be awesome. Have you ever named a car or a church van? And if so, what was the name?
We had a big blue bus that we traveled in and we called her Big Blue.
I like
Big
it.
Blue.
That's pretty chill. Can you describe for us a church member of which you were inexplicably frightened?
A church member?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Hold on. I have to think about this one because there were a lot. There were a lot of them. Okay.
She's got an arsenal.
It just got really personal because I think I have to think about it now, like because people will listen to this and I have to make sure that it wasn't one of their relatives, because they'll be excited.
Yeah, we know.
We did have a guy. So we're Pentecostal, so we did have a member who didn't have a finger because of snake handling. And so when I shook his hand, I was very aware of the fact that he did not have a finger because he got bit by a snake.
That's the best story we've ever heard on here. That takes the day.
I think that wins. the trophy goes to Raise to Stay. That's incredible.
We've had a great episode. I think we're all done here.
Thank you, guys. We'll see you next week. Oh my!
But he was an amazing
soul.
man, a very amazing man.
Oh, sure. No one's saying they're not amazing, but yes, that's awesome.
I haven't met snake handlers outside of West Virginia. I think that's been the place that I've met the majority of them, and I've met a few, and that frightens me. I don't have enough faith for that.
I don't either. Oh,
were there any songs that you grew up with that you didn't actually know the lyrics, so you just kind of made up your own?
Yeah, probably Look What the Lord Has Done. All I could remember was Look What the Lord Has Done, and then it was like all these other things that he's done, but all I could remember was Look What the Lord Has Done.
So what are some of the things that he did when you were singing that song?
Wait. It was like he touched my body, he healed my mind. It was a lot of things that were happening. So it was like head, shoulders, knees, and toes. That's probably what I was singing.
I love it. Okay, last one.
Perfect.
Finish this sentence. You might be a PK if you've ever.
Oh, swam in the baptistry.
Yes. I've been telling people this for years, and I knew I had to not be the only one. That was like the reprieve to hot summer days, was swimming in the church baptistry, but you just had to fish out the roaches and mice first, and then it was all good.
Totally. Or like the loose hair. Spiders. It was like, you would like get an extension or like part of somebody's wig or something. That was in there.
Oh my gosh!
I would rather see a spider than like loose hair like that in there, and that does happen. Anytime I see them, like
tetanus shot. You just need a good tetanus shot. You're fine.
That's right.
You're good. You're good. Eli, you grew up in the non-denom world, but if you grew up in the Pentecostal world or in like the Independent Baptist world, the lady's hair was like the higher the hair, the closer to heaven. And so there was a whole
denomination.
Well, yeah. And then when they would shout, their bobby pins would fly. So there was like bobby pins laying everywhere.
Oh, especially if you're singing "Look What the Lord Has Done." I mean, you can't sing that without getting involved in it.
Into the mashup of Enemy's Camp.
Yes.
I think I remember one of my dad's first things he had to do was in church before he became pastor was being the catcher for when people were slain in the spirit. And, that was like one of his first serving roles was to catch the people who were falling, and you never knew who was going down like a tree in the woods. He's got some awkward, hilarious stories about that for another day. So those were always fun.
I had somebody make me a modesty skirt for my keyboard because they could see my legs under the keyboard. So they velcroed. They velcroed like a pretty cloth around it.
Yeah, you can't be having a piano or a keyboard on the platform without having the Velcro cloth that surrounds it. Well, Eli, I think she wins the rapid fire round. Like, this has been the greatest one ever. It blessed me. So
I'm blessed.
Why don't you kick us off then?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, we're just honored that you're on here hanging out with us today, and I'm sure our listeners are going to love hearing you just as much as we have. And so, but just a quick kind of overview, kind of just tell the people who are listening today, kind of what gave you kind of the passion to minister towards pastors' kids and their families. So we see kind of we see kind of your posts about it, especially, you go viral all the time, but kind of the why, what gives you the heart behind wanting to do it? And really you make it kind of a ministry. And so kind of what makes you, what kind of made you want to do that?
I think I've wanted to quit a little bit of every day as a pastor's kid. I think I always wanted my own identity. I always wanted the thing that made me different, that set me apart. And I think a lot of us growing up, we knew we had a calling on our lives, and we knew that it would be different maybe than our parents, but we were so pigeonholed into one space. And so as I got older and I still wanted to quit a little bit of every day into my 40s, where I found myself literally walking the dog one day, I had moved my family from Ohio to Colorado, and it still was hard. Like, ministry wasn't getting easier the older I got. And maybe that's the lie, is that we just become so good at this, or we gaslight ourselves enough to believe that it's all good. But at 40, I'm telling the Lord, like, I'm done. Like, 40 feels like a good holy number to tap out, right? And I just felt like he convicted me so hard on that walk that it wasn't about what I was doing. It wasn't about position. Excuse me. It wasn't about title, but it was about that call that I knew I had at 15 and how he was going to use it at 40. And it wasn't being a worship leader. It was that I was going to spend the rest of my days telling the children of God why we had to get out of Egypt and get to the promised land. And it was not about being weak. It wasn't about not being good enough, but that we had a mandate. We had a call that was irrevocable, and people were quitting because it was hard, and with good reason. But that all of these things that we were called to as children were actually going to come to fruition as adults if we could just stay long enough and see the goodness of God in the land of the living. And so that's when I started writing these black boxes, was 3 years ago, and just thinking, man, if I want to quit, probably everybody else is thinking about quitting. So we just need to stay in this together. And that's kind of how the black boxes got started.
I love it. Can you think back to a particular experience that has shaped the direction of the black boxes and ministry?
Yeah, I mean, it was in this season. I was a worship leader for 20 years. So if you grew up in the Pentecostal church, it was like youth ministry and worship ministry were kind of like your vein. And I just fell in love with worship, and that was my method of ministry. I was a worship leader. That's what I did. I didn't do anything else. And when I came here from Ohio, I came here to New Life Church to be part of New Life Worship, which felt like a dream job. And I felt like finally at 37 years old, I'm finally figuring out why it was hard for the last 15 years. But when I got here, I ended up being moved out of worship through a series of events. And I had this massive identity crisis. And I think a lot of us were told in the 90s, like, to read the book of, Prayer of Jabez and expand your tent poles. And if you dream it, you can be it. And God loves dreamers. And I really believed that, like, he was going to honor my dream versus honoring his call on my life. And that's really where I had this moment where I had to release to him my identity, not only as pastor's kid, but as a worship leader. So that's two identity crises that I've lived through, is first pastor's kid, then worship pastor. And now I'm not sure who I am, because I'm not a pastor's kid anymore, and I'm not leading worship anymore. And so these black boxes became a cry of, God, who are we? If we're not what we do and all of this, then what do you require from us? And that's really where this all changed for me, was at 40 years old.
That's good. What a great perspective too. I think even, for me and John, both, and a lot of our listeners, it did feel like you were in worship or you were in youth, and those were kind of like your two lanes. And so for you to be able to really kind of say, all right, worship is how it's going to be. And that resonates with me, because that's kind of how it was for me, at least as well. So very similar experience. I want to hear maybe a little bit about some of the perks, though, of being a pastor's kid. What did some of like the positives about it? There's always, the fun, awkward stories, but what were some like really highlights for you, or some perks that you got to have? Maybe it wasn't the tomatoes that you were given to eat, but maybe it was a fun trip you got to do because of your position, or fun thing you got to do, or people you got to meet. Kind of, what are some perks that you got to experience?
We were so blessed growing up, because my dad pastored really small churches, and we didn't have all the bells and whistles that a lot of churches have now. And I have to be careful and raised to stay, because I know I had a really good childhood. I had a really fun pastor's kid experience, minus a couple of hiccups. And I also have to make sure that I don't gaslight myself and pretend that some traumatic things weren't traumatic. So I go back and forth on this one, because the truth is, I love the church now because of how much the church loved me growing up. And I never was forgotten. People celebrated my birthday all the time. We had gifts left for us. I mean, gosh, we loved funerals and weddings because we got to go from the parsonage over to the church and be with the church people, whether they were mourning or celebrating. And I just got to go visit people. Like they had, homes in different parts of the country. And we would be invited to that. Lots of good meals. I think that's why I love food. I think food was such a central part of what we did as a church family. My dad got to go Bible smuggle in China, and we just saw the kingdom from such a different perspective. And so the perks for me was community. I was never alone. I lived next door to the church. I mean, we were in constant fellowship with amazing people. And yes, it was hard. And yeah, there were late nights and big weeks of revivals and camp meetings, but I am who I am because I can't unsee the things that I saw. And I think that's what we have to remember is that, yeah, there were hard things, but man, it was mostly good. The enemy is really good at twisting things. And when I really look through a healed lens, I see that the church was really good to me and my family.
I know. I love how you put that about, I don't want to gaslight myself and call something not traumatic that was traumatic. And I know for our friend that's listening, there are some things that he's trying to figure out. And she is thinking about, is this harmful or is this something I should just forget about? I'm not really sure. I'm wrestling with it. How would you describe one of those like pains that you can look back on and go, yeah, that was pain. And that is something that I had to heal from.
The biggest one for me was just constantly being put on this pedestal, like because I was the pastor's kid, that I was a standard of holiness. And that's not normal. Like our children even my kids now, I have a 10 and a 13-year-old, both girls. I have to be really careful that people don't attach Jesus to me or to my children. That is not a normal thing that normal kids deal with. So we fall publicly, we make mistakes publicly. We are expected to behave and to act older than we are. And I think that I let people put unrealistic expectations on me, and I carried that into adulthood, where I needed people to approve of me. I needed people to think that I was special because people put that on me at such a young age. I think we have to, as church people, just know that our pastors' kids are off limits. They are humans. They have failures and faults, and they are going to act like fools sometimes, and they are still children. And I think that I just kind of adopted this pedestal life, and it's not normal. It can actually lead to some pretty harmful behaviors as adults. I dealt with eating issues and eating disorders, and really had a hard time when people didn't like me, and I carried a lot of anxiety about that. So that's just one, but pleasing man, I think, comes with a lot of us.
How do we chase healing from those things? And the reason I ask is because there is an element to some of these pains and perks that if you've never been a PK, you don't quite get it. And I think that some PKs are not seeking healing because they're not sure if there is even a person qualified for them to talk to. So what is a next step? What's the journey look like to identifying trauma and then going, I'm going to get healthy from this?
A lot of times we don't even know we have been traumatized until something happens to us and we react in a certain way. I didn't realize things were bothering me until I was on the cusp of getting fired from positions in churches because of how I was reacting to people saying certain things or doing certain things. And so I had to, first of all, get over the hurdle that going to counseling was bad. Because growing up in the church, a lot of people acted as if needing medication and needing counseling or, psychiatric help was sinful. It meant you didn't trust Jesus. And the number one thing I did for myself that I think was so helpful was getting into deliverance ministry and spiritual direction and counseling, where people who were removed from my childhood were able to really listen to me tell stories and completely just subjectively listen and know that they were coming to me as a first-time hearer. And that is when I really began to identify what was trauma what was just a really hard season and why I was reacting to leadership in some areas. I have a really hard time with men in their late 60s and 70s who are super authoritative because of some things that happened to me as a child. I have a hard time with dominating women because of a few things that happened to me as a teenager. So once I'm able to identify those things with a professional, then I'm able to start working through them. But I didn't know they were a problem until I was face to face with it again as an adult.
That's just so many good like perspectives on it, because I feel like for myself, I always feel like I had to be okay, or I had to just, and not even like, it was just kind of self put on myself. Really, it was more like, I just did it to myself, where I felt like, okay, I just have to either just be okay with it, or I just have to kind of growing up in a glass house where everyone can see you, but also throw stones, but also they want you to be okay when they do throw stones, and you can't react because then you're not a Christian, or, like all those kind of things. And so I think for me, having the space to talk about it has been huge. And very similar to you, I had an incredible growing up, being a pastor's kid, but there's always this thing that's like, it is not easy growing up in a glass house where people get to throw cheap shots just because they can, or they expect you to be holier than thou, and you don't get to grow up and make the same failures. If you do fail, it feels like, the whole world knows about it. When really they don't. But I know me and John have had conversation after conversation about this. And really one of the reasons we even started this podcast was just a way for me and him to bounce off of each other, experiences that we've gone through, and extreme highs as well that we've gone through. But it was just a safe place for both of us to connect. And so if you're listening out there, don't feel like you're alone. That's the last thing that we want for you, is to feel like you're alone, because you're going to go through times that are just going to be stinky, and they just are. And you're just not
extreme
alone at all.
high. Yeah. And you guys, there's extreme highs and extreme lows to life as a pastor's kid.
Mm-hmm.
You can be in revival in one season, personally and corporately, and the next season can be one of great loss and disappointment. And so I think we have to not gaslight ourselves, which means tell ourselves that it's not bad, just to cope. And I think a lot of us do have some coping mechanisms that we learned to survive. And that doesn't make us bad. It doesn't make us weak. It makes us human. And I think a lot of us did have to survive some seasons. We had great highs, but some of those lows, I think we kind of just tucked away to self-preserve, and that's normal, but we do need a safe place to unpack that.
Natalie, correct me if I'm wrong here, but something that you just shared reminded me of something that a previous guest shared on the topic of trauma. And so I'm going to make a statement. We have all heard the phrase, it's okay to not be okay. And we share that because it's true. But in my opinion now, I think that what I'm seeing are preachers' kids or ministers in general, that hear that and go, okay, I believe that. It's okay to not be okay. But they haven't come to grips with the fact that they're not. Is it safe to say that if you're in ministry, or if you grew up a preacher's kid, no matter how positive your experience might have felt, that there are some areas of your life where you're not okay, even if you don't know it?
Yeah. Yeah. And that is like why Jesus was so clear in his word, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I think that's why he was drawing in the dirt in front of the prostitute. There are so many times in scriptures where Jesus is very aware of our imperfections before we are. And it's why being in the Word of God and sitting in his presence is so vital to us as pastors' kids, because there are going to be blind spots in our lives that will completely come out of nowhere. And I think that's where we're seeing people run for their lives, because they went from being okay to suddenly not being okay. And we're not setting up the right expectations that this is going to be hard, no matter how nice your parents are, no matter how great the church is. The enemy is out to kill, steal, and destroy. And unfortunately, pastors' kids are not exempt from that. If anything, I feel like we have larger targets on our backs.
Yeah, I definitely just that whole part just extremely resonates, because as me and John even grew up in very different ways of growing up in terms of being a pastor's kid, and which is awesome, because we have different experiences, different kind of shared things. But in the midst of it, kind of like you said, you can be in revival in one season, yet heartbroken, at the same time. And even just in church generally, if you're even just a pastor, you understand a lot of that kind of comes hand in hand. When something good happens, it just seems like the devil's just trying to kind of get and kind of mess everything up. And how you response is just as important to all of it. And if you're a teenager out there listening to it, and maybe you're seeing your parents go through it, or maybe you're feeling it as well, maybe it's in friendship struggles or something like that you're kind of going through, and you're like, everything seems to kind of be going good, but I still have this place in me that's not. Just know that there are people there that can help you, and that you can talk through it and get it out. And like John said, yes, it's okay to not be okay, but you have to realize that you're not okay and kind of work yourself out of it as well.
And also understand too that as kids, it's really hard to see our parents sad. It's really hard to see our parents betrayed. It's really hard to see our parents lose friendships or relationships or a church. And we carry that differently than adults. When we're young, we carry that weight differently because we aren't fully formed. We are still babies. And the things that we see are unlike anything else our friends are going to see and hear. And we need to know that God has trusted us to carry that, but it is not like we're superhuman. We are still human teenagers, human young adults who are watching and hearing really hard things. And there is something to be said for just being okay with that, and then knowing how to get healing for it when we find ourselves carrying too much.
Well, speaking of carrying, you speak on your Instagram account about having influence in the church. And for some PKs, that seems like something that maybe only their parents have, or that only a deacon or trustee or elder or whatever your structure may have. And then for some, they feel like they carry a lot of influence in the church and they don't know what to do with it. What does it mean to have that influence? And how do we have it? How do we use it the right way?
Well, a lot of it is influenced by association, and whether or not we want to have it or not, we have it. And I think that's why you see some of us run, because we don't want to have eyes on us. And then you see others of us who embrace it and go into ministry and really have a hard time then when we find ourselves in positions where we're no longer the pastor's kids. So that's then the identity crisis of, oh, I no longer have influence. I'm just a regular staff person and I don't carry the same weight. And so there's so many layers to that. What I have learned and what I'm learning is that influence and authority are two different things. And I can have influence by association, but I can also have holy authority that God assigns me in certain spaces. And for me, let's use our churches, for example. Our parents automatically have authority as the pastors. We have influence as the pastor's kids. But what I started praying into was, Lord, where do I have authority in the kingdom? Because that's where I want to put my focus. If you're giving me authority in worship, if you're giving me authority in children's, if you're giving me authority with my youth group, then really give me the confidence to step out in those arenas versus just assuming I have influence by association and thinking that everybody is either for me or against me. And so if I would have known this at 13, 14, 15, I probably wouldn't have tried to be all things to all people. But we don't know that until we're adults. Hindsight's 2020. So if I could give you guys any inspiration, it's start to really find out where your heart beats in the church. Where has God given you a passion to lead his people, not please his people, but lead his people? Is it nursing homes? Is it in prisons? Is it at soup kitchens? And exercise your authority before you try to meet the demands of influence, because the authority is where you'll have covering. Influence will ebb and flow as people like you or don't like you. And as we know as pastors' kids, that could be on any given day. You're hot one minute and you're not the next.
Wow. That's incredibly deep. With authority and influence in mind, especially by proximity, there's a person I want you to speak to. It's the one who is listening and says, okay, Natalie, but I didn't stay. Mm-hmm. You were raised to stay. You did. I'm glad for you, but I didn't. So now what?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I always say the porch light's always open. Once you've found a home, you can always go home. I think staying is a word that if I could rephrase it and it still sound catchy, I would say raised to abide. I don't know that we're necessarily called to stay in a church or stay in ministry. I think that the phrase that I would like to say is raised to abide, to the vine, to Jesus. And, you know, positions will come and go, but Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And whenever we find ourselves, and I did this, I was a teacher for 10 years. I didn't want to be in ministry. I didn't go to seminary. I ended up at a public university as a kinesiology major studying exercise physiology because I didn't want to stay. The church hurt my family so bad as a senior in high school. The thought of going to a Christian university was absurd. And so I found myself in this public university with a Jewish roommate, with professors who were atheists and part of the LGBTQ community, and they were coming at me 100 miles an hour as the Christian kid. And I thought, what is this that I am in? Like, I feel like I was coming out of a cult. And I realized that it wasn't ever about the church, but that as I grew dependent on the Holy Spirit to get me through those classes and every day on a public campus, that I was raised to abide. I did love Jesus. His people ticked me off, and the leadership had ticked me off. But at the end of the day, Jesus was still Jesus. He was still the same God who did the things that I had read about. And I just had to trust that he would be faithful enough to do that in my life. And there was enough curiosity in me to want to stay to figure out how he was going to show up and rescue me from that season. And it wasn't until I was 32 that I went back into full-time church ministry and realized that I did love his people. And I had gone away and I had wandered into my own wilderness, but God showed up and gave me just enough manna for every season. And he'll do the same for you. You don't have to be raised to stay as a pastor's kid or raised to stay as a preacher or teacher, but let's rephrase it to, would you consider to be raised to abide in Christ and stay connected to his love and his mercy and his goodness to you? Because that hasn't changed. And I want to stay long enough to know who that God is. I want to know that Jesus. So that's my curiosity keeps me connected to that vine. And I pray that it will do the same for yours.
Eli, I know we're coming into our final question, but I just want to talk about Natalie in front of Natalie for a second and say that I enjoy listening to her preach. It's incredible. Yep. I love the heart. I love the content. You and I were talking before we sat down with Natalie about how every single post that she shares could be an entire episode and sometimes an entire series of messages. And to my pastor friend that's listening, here's a bit of sermon prep advice and also a very cautious form of parenting advice, because I'm a new parent, so I'm not pretending to be an expert, but I will say I have been a kid for a long time, so I know something about being the child of someone. If you're working on putting together a solid sermon, you ought to follow some trash Instagram accounts so that they can load your canon for things that are ridiculous. I can probably name 3 deconstruction or new evangelical whatever accounts that will load your canon for like the enemy's best arguments currently. But you also need to follow some that will charge you up and encourage you, and Raised to Stay is in the top 5 on that list. And you've got to get connected to this content because it's going to give you insight into how you're feeling, how your kids may be feeling. It's going to charge you up sometimes and challenge you biblically. You need this. It's a digital iron sharpening iron. And Eli, we were talking about some contrasts that Natalie makes in some of her posts, which I love. You can hear the preach coming out in them, like rogue versus rebellious, or PK is not my initials. And I'm like, yeah, that's what we've been saying. That's so stinking good. But Eli, you had a question based on one of those posts about about training ground. And I thought that was so good. Pitch that to Natalie because we've got to hear the answer.
Yes. So kind of the question is like, who am I going to be? So like, if you're reading this, like what am I training for? What is this about? And what could this possibly be training for? There's someone young out there listening and they're going, this is great, but what's next? How do I get to the next? What's next for me? They're excited. They're fired up. They are a stayer, as you would like to say. Speak to them for a second.
If we go back to how we were raised in a CEO's family. You have to think about it not as a church, but as a business. You saw behind the curtain as pastors' kids how boards were run, how a company was run, how people were treated, how people were drawn in. We delight and we retain congregants, aka customers. We saw things at a young age that taught us how to treat people, how not to treat people, how to fight for people, how to let people go. There was so much about being a pastor's kid that was very deep business culture. Whether we like to call the church a business or not, we have seen things that have qualified us to step into boardrooms, to step into classrooms, to run ERs, to start our own companies, and to do it in a way that makes Christ known. A lot of us felt guilty when we didn't feel the call into ministry because that was the assumption, is that we would be in the church. But I want to remind you, pastors' kids, that ministry is wherever you are and wherever you go, because you house Jesus Christ within you. And so it can't help but to spill out of you. The training ground was never to start your own church. The training ground was to go and make disciples. And you had a front row view to how to do that in a way that was creative, that was cultural, and that would push people to their ever-loving limits. And so it would be a really big disservice to the kingdom of God if you didn't take what you learned and take it into a dying and hurting world. It's why I was a teacher for 10 years before I went into full-time ministry, because I believed I had something in me that would bring Jesus into classrooms. And you have that same training if you can get past the bitterness and the fear and feeling inadequate. If we can get past those things, God has a platform specifically for you based off of what you have seen and heard and who he has been to you in those hard seasons.
I wish so much that I had an organ sitting here with me so that I could back you up while you're going. Like, oh my goodness. This has been one of my favorite episodes of all time. And okay, you've got to come back on the show. I hope that you will. And maybe if you have some questions, PKs for Natalie, send them to us in the DMs on Instagram and we'll tee up our next episode with her. But Natalie, thank you so much. What you've given us today has been tremendous content, but you've done something for me personally, and I just want to thank you in front of everyone for it. You've given me some handles to carry things with today, perspective that I hadn't thought of before, from the boardroom to all of those different things. Like, a lot has been thrown at us as preachers' kids, and we're carrying all of it. And if you have a basket to put it in, the load seems so much lighter. And that's what you've given us. You've given us the way to carry all of these things forward and to do it well and to go further and to go faster. And so I cannot challenge people enough to follow Natalie on Instagram, check out her podcast, and I'm just going to open it up for her to do a little mini commercial for anything and everything that she wants to share, because if it's coming from her, we co-sign on it. We're the first ones to buy it, and we can't recommend it enough. So where do we need to go? What do we need to see? And is there any awesome merch that we need to buy? Because if not, I'm putting out a Raised to Say t-shirt line. I'm just throwing that out there right now.
We'll profit off of it.
Well, you guys, listen, I love the community on Instagram. I feel like it's a safe place for all of us to have hard and holy conversations. So you can go over to Raised to Stay on Instagram. And then I have a private group on Facebook for people to just really talk about some of the harder things they don't want made public. And then also a public group on Facebook. So just look up anything Raised to Stay. You can also go to raisedtostay.com. There is a merch shop that has mugs and t-shirts and long sleeve shirts. We're just trying some things out, decals for your water bottles and laptop covers. And then finally, and I try not to say
rubber
this,
snakes.
Like, you know, yeah. Oh, wait, that's coming. They're going to be hot pink because that's my color. No, I think the biggest thing for me, guys, is the book is coming out. Pre-sales will start in November. I can't tell you the title yet or show covers until November, but everything will start coming out in November. And it's just going to be basically 12 chapters of everything that we've talked about today and so much of what you see on the account, but all brand new content. So the official release of that is July 4th.
Cannot wait. You're going to find freedom in Christ as we celebrate freedom in our country with Raised to Stay's new book. It's going to be incredible.
That's right.
Thank you so much for being here today. We can't thank you enough for all that you're doing and anything that we can do to serve you. We're excited, and I hope that a bunch of PKs go and follow you because this is needed stuff.
Thanks, guys.